If you care about how American power actually works in the real world, not on campaign stages, not in slogans, but inside alliances that decide who shows up when things collapse, you need to pay attention to what just happened. Because this is not a messaging dispute. This is not a cultural misunderstanding. This is a stress test of the transatlantic security system itself. Here is the triggering moment. In a televised interview on Fox News with Maria Bartiromo, Donald Trump made a set of claims that detonated across Europe within hours. He did not hedge. He did not qualify. He repeated them across friendly media platforms. He said NATO had never sacrificed for the United States. He said America's allies only pretended to be present in Afghanistan. He said they stayed behind the lines, not at the front. Let me say that again so it lands properly. The claim was not about burden sharing. It was not about defense spending percentages. It was about blood and whether Allied blood counted at all. And that is where this stops being about one interview, because in Europe, those statements were not heard as abstract criticism. They were heard as erasure, as a denial that Allied soldiers died alongside Americans, as a reclassification of their dead into something expendable, into the same moral category Trump has previously used when referring to American service members as suckers and losers. This is not normal. Here is the institutional context most American viewers were not given. The United States is the only country in NATO history to ever invoke Article 5. That happened after the September 11th attacks. And when that clause was triggered, every major NATO ally moved immediately. No hesitation, no negotiation. Troops were deployed to Afghanistan because the alliance treaty required it, and because the United States asked. British families lost sons and daughters. Danish families lost soldiers at one of the highest per capita rates of any country in the war. Canadians, Dutch, French forces fought and died under American command. So when Trump said those allies never sacrificed, European audiences did not hear provocation. They heard negation. The immediate reaction reflected that. Anger spread across capitals, not performative outrage, institutional fury, military families publicly stating they felt insulted, veterans saying their service had been dismissed, political leaders across party lines responding with language that was unusually direct. And here is where the second failure occurred. Large parts of the American media underestimated the scale of the diplomatic damage, treated it as another rhetorical flare-up, another Trump controversy that would burn out by the next cycle. But in Europe, this did not register as noise. It registered as a signal. And that signal did not arrive in isolation. This came on top of Trump's recent rhetoric about Greenland, threats of invasion, confusing Greenland with Iceland, reducing an autonomous territory and a key NATO partner to a block of ice, layered on top of months of sustained attacks on NATO itself. Observers on both sides of the Atlantic described it the same way. A bad situation pushed into crisis, strategic trust eroding in public. This is where the institutional question emerges. Does Trump understand what Article 5 actually is? Does he understand who died because it was invoked? Or is this a deliberate recalibration, a message that alliance obligations only run one direction? Because from a systems perspective, intent almost becomes secondary. What matters is effect. When the leader of the alliance's central power publicly denies the sacrifices of its partners, the system does not wait for clarification. It reacts. Trust recalculates. Contingency planning shifts. Assumptions change. And here is the part most people miss. Once those assumptions change, they do not snap back easily. Alliances are not emotional arrangements. They are expectation machines. They function because each side believes the other will honor past commitments when the next crisis hits. That belief just took a direct hit. And in the next phase of this analysis, you need to watch how individual outrage begins converting into institutional response, inside governments, inside militaries, and inside alliance planning itself, because that is where this moves from a statement into a power clash with long-term consequences. The first system to react was Britain, and it did not respond like a campaign surrogate. It responded like a military ally whose dead had just been written out of the record. This is where you need to understand the order of escalation. The anger did not start with politicians. It started with veterans. Ben Obese-Jecht, a conservative member of parliament and an Afghanistan veteran, did not issue a cautious statement. He issued a direct challenge. "How dare you, Donald?" That was not rhetorical flourish. That was institutional language from someone who had been there. Obese Jecht made clear he served in Afghanistan. He made clear he saw British soldiers take horrific losses. He made clear he fought alongside United States Marines. Same terrain, same enemy, same casualties. And then he delivered the line that mattered most inside military circles. Blood was shed on both sides, which means Trump's words did not just insult Britain. They insulted American forces as well. Let me pause here because this is the first pivot point. This is where the reaction moves from national pride to alliance integrity. When a veteran lawmaker says the United States president has demeaned American troops while trying to dismiss allied ones, that reframes the issue. It is no longer Britain versus Trump. It is the credibility of shared sacrifice itself. And that is why the response widened. Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, escalated the argument into moral and institutional territory. He did not speak abstractly. He cited numbers. 47 British troops killed in Afghanistan, names, families, permanent loss. Then he drew a contrast that landed hard in the United Kingdom. Trump avoided military service 5 times. And yet he now questioned the sacrifice of those who did serve. How dare he question their sacrifice? Davey did not stop there. He named domestic enablers, Nigel Farage, reform-aligned figures, politicians still praising Trump while British graves sat fresh in public memory. They should be ashamed. This is important. That line was not aimed at Trump. It was aimed inward, at Britain's own political system. Because once Allied sacrifice is dismissed externally, the question becomes who is willing to excuse it internally. And that pressure moved quickly into government. The United Kingdom's Armed Forces Minister, a former Special Forces officer who served 5 tours in Afghanistan, responded with what observers described as cold anger, not theatrical, controlled, professional. He reminded the public of a foundational fact. Article 5 was triggered after September 11th. Europe did not hesitate. Agencies, forces, and governments stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States. Then he delivered the lines that cut through the noise. We shed blood, sweat, and tears together. Not everybody came home. These bonds were forged in fire. Those sentences were not about Trump. They were about doctrine, about how alliances survive trauma. And then came the warning line that circulated rapidly through defense circles. There's only one thing worse than working with allies, that is working without them. Followed by the principle that defines coalition warfare: never above, never below, always side by side. Here is where the reaction shifts again. This is no longer anger. This is institutional memory asserting itself. When senior defense officials restate alliance doctrine publicly, it signals concern that doctrine is being challenged at the top. That concern became explicit when Lord Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff of the British Army, entered the conversation. He did not hedge. He called Trump's remarks disrespectful, wrong, outrageous. Then he asked the question that defense establishments rarely ask out loud: is he fit for the job? That is not partisan language. That is command language. Dannatt then reinserted a fact many American audiences had forgotten. The withdrawal deal with the Taliban was negotiated under Trump. Joe Biden inherited its terms. And when United States troops finally left, that agreement allowed the Taliban to regain control, collapsing 2 decades of effort. In other words, responsibility was being reassigned. And then came the moment that crystallized the institutional rupture. On BBC Newsnight, a former Trump ambassador to Denmark attempted to minimize the comments. She argued they were not a big deal. That context had been misunderstood. Steve Baker, a former conservative member of parliament, shut that down in real time. This matters. He has deeply offended our special forces. He should apologize. He should honor the fallen. This was not a debate. It was a boundary being drawn. And here is the part you cannot ignore. When former lawmakers, veterans, defense ministers, and generals converge on the same conclusion across party lines, the issue has moved beyond politics. It has entered the realm of trust and command legitimacy. And in the next phase, that trust question leaves Britain and spreads across Europe, where the casualties were even higher and the patience even thinner. If Britain was the first alarm bell, Denmark was the proof that this was not a localized reaction. This is where the issue stops being Anglo-American friction and becomes a continental rupture. Denmark lost more soldiers per capita in Afghanistan than any other country in the coalition. That fact matters here, not symbolically, structurally, because when a small nation absorbs disproportionate loss, its public memory of war is sharper, not softer, and that is why the reaction inside Denmark moved fast. Anger spread through veteran communities, not in the language of protest, but in the language of betrayal. These were soldiers who deployed because Article 5 was invoked, because the United States asked, because alliance obligations were assumed to be permanent. Let me slow this down for a second. This is where the conflict shifts from outrage to trust failure. Rufus Gifford, former United States ambassador to Denmark, put words to what many diplomats were privately saying. He stated plainly that the damage to the American brand was profound. That trust had been broken, not strained, not tested, broken. He described a personal moment that carried more weight than any policy memo. Danish friends told him he was the only American they could be seen having dinner with right now, not because he was American, but because they knew where he stood. That detail matters, because it tells you the anger was not abstract. It was social, cultural, embedded in daily life. And Gifford was clear about something else that often gets blurred in American coverage. This damage, in his view, was caused by Trump specifically, not by the United States as a whole. That distinction is important, but it is also fragile, because systems do not separate leaders from states forever. Over time, repetition hardens perception. And while diplomats were assessing reputational damage, veterans were speaking from lived experience. Royal Air Force veteran Liz McNally did not frame her response as political critique. She framed it as moral injury. She said she was instantly enraged, not offended, enraged. She flew 10 missions in Afghanistan. She served on medical evacuation aircraft. She picked up wounded and dying soldiers, American and British alike. She described risking her life so others might live. Then she said the line that has echoed across European media. We all bled the same. It didn't matter what uniform you wore. That is not sentiment. That is coalition warfare reality. Here is where the institutional gravity deepens. When veterans across nations independently repeat the same phrase and same blood, same battlefield, they are asserting a shared operational truth that political leaders cannot easily rewrite. And this is where the Sangin reference returns. Ben Obese-Jecht, speaking again on Sky News, reminded audiences that Sangin was one of the deadliest zones of the war. 1/3 of all British soldiers killed in Afghanistan died there. When British forces handed over to United States Marines, American casualties followed. So when Trump suggested allies stayed off the front lines, Obese-Jecht responded with language that left no ambiguity. To say we were off the front lines is outrageous, not inaccurate, outrageous, because it erased a documented reality, a shared chain of command, a shared casualty list. And underneath all of these reactions, one argument kept resurfacing, almost verbatim, across countries. NATO went into Afghanistan because of the United States. Article 5 was the reason. Not European self-interest, not colonial ambition, not regional strategy. It was alliance obligation. Let me underline why that matters institutionally. If Allied sacrifice is reframed as optional, performative, or secondary, then Article 5 itself becomes conditional. And once Article 5 becomes conditional in perception, the alliance ceases to function as a deterrent. This is where strategic analysts began looking beyond the immediate crisis. According to diplomatic and defense observers, new international structures are already forming. Tighter coordination between Europe and Canada, expanded outreach to Asia, conversations that quietly begin to plan around Washington rather than through it, not publicly, not dramatically, incrementally. This is not abandonment, it is hedging. And hedging, once normalized, has generational consequences. Alliances are built on habits. So are alternatives, which brings us to the uncomfortable question now circulating in European capitals. If the United States can publicly dismiss Allied sacrifice once, what stops it from doing so again when the next crisis arrives? And more importantly, if trust has already been broken at the rhetorical level, what does that mean when decisions have to be made under pressure, at speed, with lives on the line? Because at that point, this stops being about Donald Trump. It becomes a question about whether the architecture of American leadership can absorb this kind of shock, or whether it is quietly being redesigned without us watching. What makes this moment historically dangerous is not that a United States president angered allies. That has happened before. What has not happened, at least not in modern alliance history, Is a sitting American president publicly denying the sacrifice of Allied soldiers who died fighting under United States command? Let me be very precise here. This is not about a misphrased comment. This is not about rhetorical excess. This is about whether sacrifice itself is recognized as real. And that is why attempts to reframe this as a misunderstanding failed almost immediately, because the core issue is not interpretation. It is perception of the alliance itself, what it means, who it is for, and what moral obligations come with leadership. Here is where the institutional line gets crossed. When words touch graves, they stop being politics. When words reach families who buried sons and daughters, they stop being debate. When words reopen trauma for veterans living with lifelong injuries or post-traumatic stress, they become a form of institutional harm. That is the red line. European officials and veterans were not responding to tone. They were responding to erasure, to the suggestion that the dead did not count, that Allied blood was somehow secondary. This is where Europe's internal assessment hardened. Donald Trump is not simply another American president with an unconventional style. He is viewed as categorically different, and treating him as if he fits into the same historical pattern has been identified as a strategic mistake. That realization carries consequences. Across European capitals, the message has been consistent and increasingly explicit. Appeasement does not work. Normalization does not work. The old assumption that the alliance will automatically self-correct no longer holds. You hear it now in language that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. We will not be America's little brother. We need strength, not accommodation. Those are not slogans. They are positioning statements. They signal a shift in how Europe sees itself inside the alliance, not as a dependent partner, but as an actor preparing for uncertainty. Here is where the historical echo matters. NATO has survived crises before: Vietnam, Iraq, strategic disagreements that cut deep, but those conflicts were about policy choices. This one is about memory, about whether shared sacrifice is acknowledged as foundational or treated as disposable. Alliances are not sustained by hardware alone. They are sustained by belief, by the conviction that when the cost is paid, it will be remembered. Once that belief cracks, deterrence weakens. Planning changes. Alternatives are explored, quietly at first, then structurally. And that is why this moment is not over, even if the headlines move on. Because NATO does not forget. Military institutions archive everything. Diplomatic corps remember patterns. Veterans remember words. The open question now circulating in Allied capitals is not whether the United States is powerful. That is not in dispute. The question is whether it is reliable under moral pressure. Will NATO trust Washington when the next real crisis hits and decisions have to be made in hours, not weeks? Can the United States lead an alliance when the sacrifices of its partners are publicly discounted? And if Allied blood is no longer counted as equal, then what exactly is this alliance still built on? That question has no easy answer. And the fact that it is now being asked out loud should concern anyone who believes alliances are not inherited, but maintained. Thank you for listening. Before you step away, share your perspective in the comments. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit like and subscribe, then turn on notifications so you don't miss the most critical political developments as they break day after day. See you next time.